Hey everyone! In this video, I'm going to be talking about adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. So we're going to talk about the rules of how to solve addition and subtraction problems of fractions when you have unlike denominators as well as like denominators. And then we're going to go through a few examples of both addition and subtraction in these instances. So to start with, I'd like to go over the rules for adding and subtracting fractions. There's about 5 rules to follow, or steps, and if you follow these rules, it'll make adding and subtracting fractions really easy. So the first rule is to make the denominators the same. And to do that, we want to find the least common denominator, which is sometimes referred to the LCD. Or we can also think of this as the least common multiple. And I had another video where I talked about multiples. And if you list both multiples of two numbers, you can find the lowest number they have in common. And that's called your least common multiple, or we can refer to it for fractions as our least common denominator. That's the denominator we're going to want to use for both fractions. So when we're adding fractions or subtracting fractions, we have to have the same denominator. So we need to find that least common denominator before we can do anything. Once we find the least common denominator, we want to make equivalent fractions. Using our LCD, or our least common denominator. Once we've made those equivalent fractions, we've turned both of our fractions into new fractions with the same denominator. We're going to keep the denominator the same. We're going to change both fractions to have the same denominator. Then we're going to keep the denominator for answer. We're just going to add or subtract the numerators. And then once we've done that, we now have an answer, and we have to check and simplify if needed. So those are the 5 steps to adding and subtracting fractions. If we follow those steps, it'll make adding and subtracting fractions a breeze. So let's practice using these rules or steps to work out a few addition and subtraction of fractions. So let's practice adding fractions first. So if we're adding the fractions 1/2 plus 2/3, we want to rewrite our fractions so that they are, instead of horizontal, they are now vertical. Now, we don't have the same denominator, so we need to change them to the least common denominator. And to do that, we want to look for the least common multiple. So if I'm listing my multiples of 2, I'm going to say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Those are my first few. And for 3, they're going to be 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. I'm going to stop there because I see a few numbers in common. I see that both lists have a 6 and they have a 12. But we're looking for the least common multiple or least common denominator. So the smallest number they have in common. And in this case, for 2 and 3, the least common multiple is 6. So that means I'm going to make my denominator 6 for both of my fractions. Now I need to make equivalent fractions using that least common denominator. So how do I go from 2 to 6. Well, I had to multiply by 3. Whatever I do to my denominator, I have to do to the numerator. So I'm going to multiply 1 times 3 to get my new fraction of 3/6. The same thing with my 2/3. I figure out, okay, how did I get from 3 to 6? Well, for this fraction, I multiplied by 2. And whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to my numerator. So 2 times 2 equals 4. So when I add my two new fractions, I'm going to keep my denominator 6, and I'm just going to add my numerators. So 3 plus 4 equals 7. My answer is 7/6. Well, I know that 7/6 is an improper fraction. So I want to change that improper fraction into a mixed number. And to do that, I'm going to divide because all fractions are division problems. So I want to think, okay, this 7/6 is 7 divided by 6. Well, how many times can 6 go into 7? One time. And 1 times 6 is 6. And when I subtract, I get a remainder of 1. So that means that when I simplify this, I'm going to have 1 whole. And then my remainder is 1. So it's going to become my numerator. And my denominator is going to stay the same, my 6. Or my divisor that was out front here. So my final answer simplified is 1 and 1/6. Because 1 is 6/6 plus my 1/6 equals our 7/6. Now let's look at number 2. We have 2/7 plus 1/4. Well, our denominators are not the same, so we need to make equivalent fractions for each of these. So let's rewrite it horizontally, from horizontal to vertically. So we have 2/7 plus 1/4. Well, I'm going to think about this. How am I going to change these into least common denominators of 7 and 4? So my multiples of 7 would be 7, 14, 21, 28, 35. My multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. And if I look at these two lists, my least common multiple is 28. That means my least common denominator is going to now be 28. So I'm going to make the denominator 28 for both of these. And to do that, I now need to make my equivalent fractions. I have to figure out, how did I go from 7 to 28? Well, if I look at my multiples, I had 1, 2, 3, 4. So I multiplied by 4. And whatever I do to my denominator, I have to do to my numerator. So 2 times 4 equals 8. So my new fraction is 2/7 is equal to 8/28. Now I have to change 1/4 into 28. And if I look at my list of multiples for my 4, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That means I multiplied by 7. And whatever I do to my denominator, I have to do to my numerator. So 1 times 7 is 7. Now I have 8/28 plus 7/28. And 8 plus 7 is 15, and I keep my denominator of 28. I have 15/28. And when I think about those two numbers, I want to think, can I simplify them? Well, my factors of 15 would be 1 and 15, 3 and 5. Well, 5 doesn't go into 28, 3 doesn't go into 28, and 15 doesn't go into 28. So that means that this fraction is in simplest form. So my answer is just 15/28. All right, let's look at a couple more examples of addition. So we have 4/10 plus 4/5. I'm going to rewrite them vertically. So 4/10 plus 4/5. And we have different denominators, so we need to make them the same denominator by making equivalent fractions. And to do that, we have to find our least common multiple. So my multiples of 5 are 5, 10, 15, 20. And my multiples of 10 are 10, 20, 30, 40. And I look at this, and as soon as I see that I have something in common in both lists, I can stop. And usually we don't have to do too many. And I see that my least common multiple is 10. So I'm going to make both of these fractions have a denominator of 10. When I do that, in the first fraction, I'm keeping the denominator the same. That means I'm multiplying by 1. And when I multiply by 1, my answer stays the same. So 4 times 1 is still 4, and 10 times 1 gives us the 10. Now for 5, to get 10, I multiplied by 2. So 4 times 2 equals 8. Now I'm going to add my 4 tenths plus 8 tenths. I'm going to keep my denominator 10, and 4 plus 8 is 12. Now again, we have an improper fraction. So I'm going to do my division. 12 divided by 10. 10 goes into 12 one time, and 1 times 10 is 10. When I subtract, I get a remainder of 2. That means that my fraction of 12 tenths is the same as saying 1 and 2 tenths. But if I look at 2 tenths, I can simplify 2 tenths. And I can say that 1 and 1/5 is the same as 2 tenths, 1 and 2 tenths. Because I divided by 2, and I keep my 1 whole the same. So my final answer here is 1 and 1/5. All right, let's add number 4. 2/12 plus 2/4. Let's rewrite them vertically. 2/12 plus 2/4. And if I look at these two numbers, I know they have different denominators, so I need to find the least common multiple. Well, my multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12. Ooh, I know that my multiples of 12 are going to be 12, 24, and that means that my least common multiple is 12. So my 2/12 is going to stay the same because it already had a denominator of 12, and my 2/4 is going to become 12ths. Now to do that, I have to figure out, how did I go from 4 to 12? Well, I multiplied by 3. And whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. So 2 times 3 is 6. So now I'm adding 2/12 plus 6/12. I keep my denominator the same, and I add my numerators. 2 plus 6, which equals 8. Now 8 and 12 are both even numbers. But I also know that my factors of 8 are 1 and 8, 2 and 4. And my factors of 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. If I see that my greatest common factor here is 4, I can simplify this fraction by dividing by 4 to both the numerator and the denominator. So 8 divided by 4 equals 2, and 12 divided by 4 equals 3. So my simplified fraction would be 2/3. If I wasn't sure, but I saw that 8/12, they were both even, so I divided by 2, and I got 4, 6. And I saw, 4 and 6 are both even, so I can divide by 2 again, and I get 2/3, which is the same answer. It's just simplifying once or simplifying twice, and either way works. So that's how we add fractions with uncommon denominators or unlike denominators. Now let's look at a few examples where we're subtracting fractions that might have uncommon denominators or unlike denominators. We have 6/10 minus 4/8. Let's rewrite these again like we did for the addition problems so that they are vertical. Now, we want to make sure that our denominators are the same because that's our same rule. We want to make our denominators have a common denominator. So we have to list the multiples of 8. So 8, 16, 24, 32, 40. And my multiples of 10 are 10, 20, 30, 40. Well, here's where I have my least common denominator, 40. So both my fractions are going to become fractions with a denominator of 40. And to do that, I have to say, okay, how do I go from 10 to 40? Well, I multiply by 4. So I have to multiply the numerator by 4. So 6 times 4 equals 24. Now, to go from 8 to 40, I have to multiply by 5. So I'm going to multiply my numerator in this fraction by 5, because whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to my numerator. So 4 times 5 is 20. Now I'm subtracting, so 24 minus 20 equals 4, and my denominator stays 40. Well, I'm looking at 4 and 40. I know that my factors of 4 are 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. And I know that 40 can be divided by 4 because 4 times 10 is 40. So if I divide these both by 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 40 divided by 4 is 10. So my simplified answer is 1/10. Now let's look at number 2. 2/8 minus 1/6. Well, if I have 2/8 minus 1/6, I want to make those two fractions have the same denominator. So I want to think, what are my multiples of 8? My multiples of 8 are 8, 16, 24, 32. Those are my first 4. Now my multiples of 6 are 6, 12, 18, 24. And if I look at those, my first common factor, or my first common multiple, is 24. So if I make 24 the new denominator, I now have to make my equivalent fractions. So to go from 8 to 24, I multiply by 3. So I have to do 2 times 3 to get my new numerator. And 2 times 3 is 6. Now I look at my second fraction. I went from 6 to 24, so I multiplied by 4. Now I multiply the numerator by 4, and 1 times 4 is 4. If I'm subtracting 6 24ths minus 4 24ths, I'm going to keep my denominator the same, the 24, and then I'm just going to subtract my numerators. 6 minus 4, which equals 2. I'm looking at 2 24ths, and I have to check, can I simplify? Well, I know they're both even numbers, so I can divide by 2, divide by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. So that means that my answer is simplified as 1/12. All right, let's look at 2 more examples of subtraction. Let's rewrite this. 4/5 minus 2/3. Now, I want to rewrite these fractions with the same denominator. So I need to find the least common multiple or least common denominator. If I list my multiples of 5, I have 5, 10, 15, 20. And my multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And I now have one in common. This 15 is in both. So I can make my common denominator 15 for both fractions. So how do I go from 5 to 15? Well, I multiply by 3. So whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to my numerator. 4 times 3 equals 12. And the same thing for the second fraction. 3 times 5 equals 15. So 2 times 5 equals 10. Now I subtract. I keep my denominator the same and just subtract my numerators. 12 minus 10 equals 2. And since 2 is even and 15 is odd, the only factors of 2 are 1 and 2. And since 2 can't go into 15 evenly, we have our answer or our difference in simplest form. Let's look at one more example. We have 5/7 minus 2/3. I need to make these two fractions have the same denominator. And to do that, I need to find my least common denominator or my least common multiple. So let's look at my multiples of 7. 7, 14, 21, 28. And my multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. Still don't have anything in common, so I have to keep going. 21. Oh, those are the same. So my least common denominator is going to be 21. So when I change my fractions into equivalent fractions with a denominator of 21, I look at my first 5/7. How do I go from 7 to 21? Well, I had to multiply by 3. So I multiply my numerator by 3, and 5 times 3 is 15. Now I look at my second fraction, 2/3. Well, I did 3 times 7 to get 21, so 2 times 7 equals 14. Now I'm subtracting 15 21st minus 14 21st. I'm going to keep the denominator the same and subtract our numerators. 15 minus 14, which is just 1, and 1/21st is the simplest form. So remember, when we're adding or subtracting fractions, we always want to find our least common denominator by finding our least common multiple. Make both of our fractions have the same denominator, and then add and subtract our fractions by keeping our denominator the same, then adding and subtracting our numerators. I hope this helps you guys.